let's I'll just give a quick introduction of some of the background information. Okay, so one of the things that he talks about is G. G stands for general intelligence. It also gets sometimes called the Spearman factor. Okay, so like one of the things that came off to me is that he feels this is an important part of human intelligence. Okay, so this is where G came from. In the past, they were trying to make tests to figure out if students, how well they do at say history or English or math or physics or reading or whatever, right? And it was mostly, as far as I know, it was around providing special education. And there's two forms of special education, right? If you're struggling a bit with a topic, they will give you special education to kind of catch you up, so you wouldn't have to go as fast as the class. But also, if you're a bit quicker than the class, you also need special education, or else you're going to be bored and not learn it as well. So you need to put into a class that's a little more advanced, right? Here's what they discovered. What they discovered is with most people, if you tended to do well at one of these tests, you tend to do well at all of them, right? And that doesn't mean, for example, if I got 1 point higher than Bruce on the math test, I would get 1 point higher than Bruce on every single test, right? It can vary a bit. But what they found is there's a correlation, right? This is what G is. This is what the Spearman factor is, this correlation. Now, people argue oh, that's weird. I can hear myself. Someone should mute. People argue about what this actually means. Like, what does this correlation mean? Some people even think it's not actually real, right? Like, you have this correlation. There's people who debate this, that think like maybe this correlation between the things, it doesn't represent something real. Some people think it is actually real, right? Now, the people who take do this AGI thing, they think there's this very general thing that is intelligence. We don't actually understand what it is, but there's this general thing. And this is the approach when you try to create human-like intelligence, if you take the AGI approach. But that is debated, right? Some people think, for example, that what G, this correlation, represents is what's called mutation load, right? Every human, every individual has, you have about half the genes from your mother, half from your father, but some of them are different, right? Most of these are mutations, and they come in different forms. Like, it could be just like a single, SNP that's mutated, or you can get inversion, or you can get deletions, or you can get like copy number variations. You get lots and lots of things. What happens though is most of these mutations are slightly harmful, right? Every now and then you win the lottery and you get some, special power, like maybe you get disease resistance, or you get laser eyes, or, new wings or something like that. But like, most of these mutations are slightly harmful. It's not so bad, but you're a little uglier than you would have been. You're a little shorter than you would have been. Your immune system's a little weaker than you would have been, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you find that, for example, like when you compare G to like a lot of other things, it's correlated across many, many things. Some people think it's this mutation load, right? Like in our system, like our genome seems to be a hack, like a single, piece of DNA affects many, many, many things. So if you break it, it doesn't break one system, it breaks many, many, many systems. It'll break some of the stuff that goes on in your brain, it'll break some of the stuff with your immune system, et cetera, et cetera. And one idea of like what maybe G is it's basically a kind of negative, an inverse like measure of how much mutation load you have, how many of these broken genes that you have, right? Now, if that's the case, I don't think it tells you something about how intelligence actually works in the human mind, right? This is kind of like, sorry, there's fucking cars over there. This is something that just tells like how screwed up you kind of are. Like maybe that's a bad way to say it. It's not a flattering way to say it, but like how many kind of screwed up things. But if this is true, then believing that there's a general thing as intelligence is just, you're going in the completely wrong direction. In this paper, he seems to take that approach. Now, he acknowledges some other things, right? Like humans have a lot of stuff built into them, right? Like we have a lot of, it's like, for example, like one thing we've discussed during this meetup before is that, when you create like this human vision system, first you teach the machine learning system how to see, and then you teach it how to recognize a cat and a frog or a toothbrush or whatever, right? Where like humans have a lot of stuff evolved in us. There is debates over how that actually happens, right? Like one approach is what they call the mental modules, right? And the basic idea is that if you open up the human body, you don't find it's this homogeneous kind of goo, right? You have structure there, you have organs, you have lungs and livers and hearts, and they're evolved to do something, right? And it doesn't mean they can do it on their own. You can't take the heart, put it on a table, and like it'll just function by itself. It's made to plug in on other things, but you have this structure of organs. Some people think you have a kind of psychic organ. You have organs in your mind. Maybe they're localized in parts of the brain, or maybe they're distributed, right? This is one thought. This isn't the only thought. There's stuff that's a lot more like what we would call reinforcement learning in machine learning, although it's not pure reinforcement learning because you have other things affecting it. Anyways, that's the basic idea. The history of G is discovery, right? It was basically you found a correlation between a bunch of tests. Now, here's the thing. If you cohort people with an IQ above 130, G disappears. There is no G, right? What does that suggest? This, to me, this is consistent with the mutation load theory, right? It doesn't mean it's prove it's that. It could be interpreted in a different way. Sorry, I like this time of the day. I get so many damn sirens going by. I'm moving soon, supposedly, so I'll deal with this. Anyways, if it's like, okay, so you look at the people like above 130, right? G disappears, right? The Spearman factor disappears. To me, this suggests it's consistent with the mutation load theory. It also suggests that intelligence isn't a single thing, right? And that means that if you're taking the approach to create AGI and you think intelligence is a single thing, you're not going to create human-like intelligence. Maybe they'll discover something interesting, but it doesn't seem to be human-like intelligence. The other thing the paper mentions is the crystal intelligence versus fluid intelligence. Crystal versus fluid is theory, right? The G, the Spearman factor, is an empirical finding. It's a discovery, right? You can debate whether it's represents something real or not, and people do, but it's a discovery. Crystal versus fluid is theory. That means it's like, they go look for data for it. It might be true, it might not be. It's not really known whether it is or not. This is just part of it. There are competing theories to this. Anyways, that's kind of like my background information. Like Matt's got stuff to say though too. I'll mute myself. Matt, you're muted, so you have to unmute.
Yeah. So. Oops.
Can you hear me? Yes? Okay, great.
Yes.
So yeah, I kind of went over this paper like quite finely, so I'll try to give like a kind of top level overview of what's going on here. Francois Chollet is like a very famous deep learning guy. He's the guy who invented Keras. He's been working at Google forever, and he's very much like a very philosophical guy and quite argumentative if you look him up on Twitter. And he has been trying to refine or kind of define like what is the future of AI, right? And the sort of product that has come out of like a lot of his philosophical musings is this paper, and in addition to this paper, he has a data set. And the reason why he has this data set is he kind of talks about these different sort of ways of evaluating AI. Like there's the classic like Turing test, right? Of, oh, well, if I'm talking to someone, if I can't figure out if it's a human or not, then for a certain percentage of the time, then, like we should consider that to have artificial intelligence. Well, we've kind of gotten to that point in many cases where like a chatbot can fool us some of the times, especially like if we use some kind of dirty tricks when we program them to like, act very like sarcastic and stuff like that. Apparently like the best like Turing test completing agent is, I think she's like a sarcastic Russian girl chatbot, right? Because all the language kind of comes out not exactly perfect, but you would kind of expect that. And also whenever the program doesn't know anything, then it will just like give a sarcastic response, and that seems human-like enough, right? So one of the problems with the Turing test is it requires like human judges, right? Which just puts the onus of defining what like intelligence is onto the humans. It is not objective, and it's not very scalable, right? So what Francois Chollet is trying to do here, Chollet, is he's trying to come up with a reasonable working definition of intelligence, at least in the framework of AI, right? And then he wants to create some sort of benchmarking tool so that we can start making progress towards what his definition of intelligence is. And it takes him like about 57 pages to do so, right? But there's a lot of stuff here that is because he's trying to essentially he's trying to give all these formalisms, so it's longer than it it needs to be if we're just like talking about it. But he's doing that to try to make this thing like ironclad, right? So what is his definition of intelligence? It's actually a part of it is here. It's not the full thing, but he essentially says that we are going to think about intelligence, and Charles talked about the difference between crystallized intelligence and fluid intelligence, and how that's like not a real distinction. It's theoretical, but Chollet is more interested in the fluid intelligence version right here. He's interested in skill acquisition efficiency, And then in addition, he is also interested in that kind of bounded by the scope of the problems, the generalization difficulty. So like just the general like difficulty of looking at some examples. The priors. So what are the sort of innate things that say we are given as humans that machines don't have, like a concept of like a contiguous object, right, is something that you have to program into a computer that we immediately understand. Like we can point at an object and say, oh, that is a pop can or that is a book without any special training, right? And then experience. So one of his big complaints about how the field is currently evolving is that a lot of models are just, well, we took in all the data that we could find everywhere across the internet, and then we ran it for a really long time in like a supercomputer, and lo and behold, we got pretty good results on a relatively narrow thing, right? So there are some kind of counter arguments to that, like GPT-3 recently came out, and it seems to have some ability to generalize. So supposedly it can do like a little bit of arithmetic without being explicitly trained on arithmetic, but even that is a little bit questionable. So he's more interested in broad generalization. Okay, so what does this look like as an equation, right? So like what are we actually optimizing for? Well, he uses, and I'm just going to go way past this because I know everyone has like a lot of opinions about this. So I'm just going to try to be as fast as possible. Here you see this general intelligence G, these abilities, right? So in a psychometrics kind of point of view, this would be something like you would have systematic thinking, so your ability to kind of structure a problem, and then you would have something like, I don't know, creativity might be one of them, your ability to think laterally, et cetera, right? And all of those will contribute to G in some way or be evidence of G. Blah, 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 blah. So yeah, one of the really big things that he keeps on hitting on multiple times is there are several types of generalization, and I'll just like very quickly go into them. So he talks about how there's a spectrum between like, say, a preset algorithm that can solve a Sudoku has no generalization beyond just like Sudoku, right? And a machine learning model that, it's like a linear regression, it can do decent as long as you have like relative, like the new data points that you're given are relatively within distribution, right? So that's kind of like there's no generalization. You got some shallow generalization. What he's interested is in the sort of like broad generalization, and then he talks about like one level above that, which I don't really see the distinction between extreme generalization. So broad generalization would be a lot of the kind of AGI applications that you've heard about before, self-driving cars that are truly self-driving, where they never need any intervention, would be one of these like broad generalization algorithms. The kind of classic example that he gives is the Woz coffee cup challenge, where you should be able to tell a robot, hey, fetch me a cup of coffee, and it doesn't matter what room the coffee is in, or like what the machine is, or what the mug is, that robot should be able to fetch you a cup of coffee and come back and give you the cup of coffee without burning you, right? And then extreme generalization is where we are, right? We are able to look at new problems, and I'll actually show some examples of the like ARC challenge right now, or not right now, after I do this little spiel. So we are able to do all sorts of things that we were just like not evolved to do. So that's actually probably a pretty good thing to try to hit for. If we want to make machines that are as smart as humans, we should just kind of look at humans and see what we can get out of it. But obviously this is a very incomplete science. All right, so that's kind of broadly the types of generalization. And then he also makes an important distinction here, which is something that like I've harped on before, which is you have like a system-centric kind of view of generalization, where it's just like, okay, yeah, here are new points from like the test set. I put it in, and lo and behold, it does a pretty good job. So we have generalization. But he cares about something called developer-aware generalization, which is like, what if you are thrown a new data point that you just never considered as the programmer, right? So if like you have a dogs and cats sort of identifier, and there's a new type of dog, right? You could never prepare for that, right? But your algorithm hopefully should be able to handle that. Right now, not so great. So, blah blah blah. There's a lot of stuff going on here. We can talk about that later. This is kind of the big schematic that he talks about. He really cares about something called program synthesis. So his sort of idea is you have this intelligent system. So, and often case this could be like a developer, right? But let's talk about like the kind of neural net example here. So the intelligent system goes through all this training, and what it does is it generates a skill program. So, it starts with that random initialization of weights. It tries to do some task. We'll say it's like reinforcement learning. So it's trying to play an Atari game, and it totally craps out right at the end. That's bad. It does like a big training loop, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. After a million billion steps, it says, okay, no more training. Well, the developer says no more training. Show me what the final model is. And the final model is just, a bunch of like matrices with different weights on them. And then it will run through an Atari game, right? So this is an example of what he calls like program synthesis, but he's more interested in, well, what if we give the AI all of the human priors, right? So the ability to count, the ability to check objects, et cetera, and then what the AI has to do is generate a program that will get the correct guess on some sort of like IQ-like test, right? And that's where his idea for the ARC, which is the Advanced Reasoning Corpus, really comes from. This is kind of like the schematic of what's going on here. I know there's like a lot of stuff, and I'm kind of talking fast on it if you haven't read it before. But he talks about generalization difficulty. He comes up with like this right here. This is his definition of intelligence, kind of put into an equation. And there's a lot of stuff going on here. And I wouldn't actually really worry about trying to understand. Well, you should understand like what's going on here, but you should also know that things like this generalization difficulty cannot be computed, at least in any sort of practical way. So I believe that generalization difficulty is the shortest, Turing machine that can correctly give you the answer to a certain problem, given the initial state, what was T again? The task, and then the curriculum, which is just the training regimen, right? So the training data that you got. But this cannot be calculated. I'm not even sure if it can be estimated properly. And lo and behold, inside of the ARC data set, or the way that the ARC data set is actually measured, it does not take into account generalization difficulty, which I think is a weakness of the ARC data set. Okay, I'm going to stop talking about the paper itself. I just want to show you what it actually looks like. So does anyone want to say, is anyone brave enough to say like what the answer to this is? Or actually, not what the answer to this is, but like what is the rule that governs all of these things? Because it like some of these things are harder than others. I don't think this one is particularly.
For that one, I think it's just the blue is the largest one, the red is the smallest, and yellow is the.
Yeah, totally. And I'll just do that real quick.
And all the geometry stays the same. Otherwise.
Yes, and that is actually another one of the priors is this idea of object permanence.
All right.
And then I'll submit this. And it was the correct solution. So great. But sometimes you get ones that's like, oh man, this will just take a very long time to figure out. This one's not so bad. But anyway, these are just from the training set. There's a private set as well. So what happened kind of after this paper was released is he released the ARC data set onto Kaggle, and it was kind of called the most difficult Kaggle competition of all time. And the winning solution, which was essentially just a greedy search along like a massive tree, got approximately like 20% of the test set correct. So there's obviously a really far way to go. So I think like my takeaway from this paper is I'm not going to say finally, because there are other competitions that try to get us towards AGI, but I think they're not as well publicized. We have a benchmark now for something that is like human-like intelligence when it comes to like pattern recognition. which would be a very useful module for all sorts of like agents to have, right? And we have people who are interested in doing it, but we're still like a really far away. So like thinking about what the winning solution has nothing to do with the last 10, maybe even 20 years of machine learning research. Like it was just not applicable to this challenge. I saw some people working with decision trees, but not much else. So I think it's just really interesting that for as much progress as we have made in this field, we are still very far away from the stated goal of actually getting us to human-like intelligence. And I will stop talking now because I've already talked quite a bit.
The benchmark's very much like a Ravens test. It has the same feel as that. I don't know if you're talking, Matt, but yeah, it feels like a Ravens test. I mean, like it. I'm not convinced. Like, I mean, like I think it's whether you currently think that there is like there's a general thing for intelligence, right? Like it's not clear to me that there is, right? I think there's, like, at least my understanding of the evidence, it looks like it's not something like that, right? And if there is a kind of general thing, it seems it's almost like, just like how not fucked up your genes are, like in a sense, right? Like how small of a mutation load do you have? And that seems to be like what G's picking up. But like, I don't think that's what people really think about as intelligence, right? Like, how well does your system kind of work? Right. I mean, that's it's something, right? But like, I think if you just had a well-working system without a whole bunch of other stuff, people wouldn't consider that intelligence. It's only in the context of like having a whole bunch of other things that even matters.
So I think that like Francois would actually agree with you because he brings up the AI effect, which is as soon as someone can program a way of doing something on a computer, it no longer becomes AI, right? AI is always something in the future, in the same way that, like, Go used to be something that was, if we could get Go, that would be AI. If we could get, chatbots that work half decently, and I know that they don't, but like, we're kind of getting there, right? That would be AI, but it would still be very useful.
What the solutions look like, though, right? Like the fact that this ArcKaggle was a tree search exhaustive means no, we didn't solve AI. We just made a test set that could be hacked in a stupid way again.
Right.
It's also like, what is AI? If the goal of AI is to make intelligence like us, it's not clear what intelligence like us is. And that's part of the problem. The AGI's people, at least implicitly with a name, they're assuming there's something very general about our intelligence. I don't think that's a given, right? I mean, maybe it is, but there's also other interpretations of the data about humans that could be interpreted in a different way. Like it might not be something general, other than like the parts about like it's just how well your kind of system works. But I don't think that by itself is intelligence.
Yeah. So I looked at this work. Some of them it's a well-written piece of work, but some of his goals are like wishful thinking at best. So. But his own model of intelligence, the way he framed it, and he was able to express it mathematically precise in terms of what he was assuming, even though he didn't tell us how we can incorporate the priors or any of those variables, or how can we estimate those even in practice. So I think this is just like one of those theoretical papers in machine learning, those kind of VC dimensions stuff that you can't know how to use it. So, but those like they help build intuition. So I think that's where this paper lies. It's a paper that builds intuition, not a paper that would help you solve anything, but just to help you build intuition. And those kind of work are very useful too.
Yeah, I mean, I think he's trying to summarize some of the stuff in behavioral sciences for people who aren't familiar with behavioral sciences. Like some of the stuff he goes into, like if you've looked at psychometrics, if you looked at like different forms of behavioral sciences, you're quite aware of this stuff. You're quite aware of this debate. But he picks out one part of it, right? Like certain specific points of views and runs with that, which is fine. I mean, if you just wanted to try something, but he, at least as far as I could tell, like he's not fully covering the whole debate. There's a lot of parts he seems to be missing.
I don't
in the
think
paper.
I want him to. I think my biggest problem is that he keeps insisting that we have to relate to humans, and that's just.
I don't think he said that though. I think he said that a couple of times. There's a lot of flaws with having everything being like. What was the term?
He explicitly said he disagrees with people who don't base it on humans in the paper.
Yeah. Okay.
And frankly, his priors, he said already, they're shared with animals, and really they're just about living in the universe that we live in, right?
Yeah.
Like the actual priors he lists are really universal. So
it's funny because he did criticize that approach as well in earlier parts of like the introduction. So I guess.
So when I was analyzing the paper, I couldn't. I had to look at it into some sort of like natural science point of view and perspective, and I take on Lara's point that he uses some interesting analogies. So what he calls his priors, I think that it's not as simple as he seems to make it. Actually, if I might be honest, I can be honest. It also felt a little bit like a hard fetch.
I don't think he thinks it's easy. He said that is one of the challenges at one point.
But even to the extent or to the point to believe that can be understood, it's a little harder. And the reason behind that is because these priors sometimes are underlying layers of competition that represent emergent properties, right? So there are complex systems of evolution by themselves. So he talks a little bit about natural evolution, which is actually a little misleading because I think that he refers there to what is called natural selection. So I think that there has to be a better amalgamation of the processes with which we understand the mechanism of evolution before we can jump ahead into trying to emulate at the level of human behavior. And I think that what helps a lot in that perspective is escalating over different layers of using phylogenes, right? Using different levels of organization for which we could even use things that we don't even conceive as intelligent, like plants, which in many scenarios, as a biologist, I can say that they show pretty smart sort of behaviors.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on what you define as intelligence, right?
Yes, exactly. Absolutely.
And I mean, that's part of what he's trying to do in the paper. I think some of that won't be satisfying to people. And also, if you're trying to create human intelligence, some of the parts, I don't remember off the top of my head right now, because I read this like 2 weeks ago, but some of the parts where he tries to starts to try to define intelligence, I kind of wonder, like, would humans actually satisfy your requirements, right? Like, do humans actually work this way?
So
that's
the core knowledge,
like this whole insisting on, first of all, mimicking evolution as it happened is pointless. Let them learn how they need to learn. We don't need to have them encode our priors in the same way we do. That shouldn't be important. We should always be thinking about what are the tasks that need to be done. This is the part the paper I think gets right. There's some scope that we want them to accomplish. Let's acknowledge the scope. Open the field, make sure that they're learning within that scope, within whatever priors they could encode, and that's where you limit them to get the playing field for the evaluation to be even. But I think we're just wasting time really thinking about how do humans really think, what is human intelligence. Those are fraught with horrible disasters that there's just no need, right?
But
like,
that's the only success story we have, right? That's the only successful example of what the type of intelligence we're looking for. There's no other example.
It's also the goal. It's the goal of goal of making strong AI or AGI or cognitive AI is to make something like us. Yes. And then it's hard not to like include us if you're trying to make something like us.
Well, I'm with Laura on this. Actually, Bruce, you should go.
I'm totally with Laura on this as well, because why are we trying to replicate humans with machines? If you imagine the day we could actually make a machine that is as smart as a human, like it's easier to just make a baby, and there you go.
That's true.
I think making machines that have different priors and are good at things that we're not good, like protein folding. It'd be great. humans are terrible at doing that because we have no priors that are anywhere close to being able to do protein folding. If we had some machine intelligence that could figure out some stuff like that, and great, let's do that. So I've never been very interested in AGI, partly for that reason, I guess. However, having said all that, I think, given that's the framework he set for himself in the paper, he did a good job of it.
That was the whole point, right? Like he was trying to set up a framework to give us a notion of how we can even evaluate the performance on AGI, right? So if you don't feel like it's something that's like specifically within your interest, I can totally see why this whole stuff seems like unnecessary.
I think other forms of intelligence are way more interesting. Like, I mean, octopi, they're intelligent. Like,
but also artificial intelligence never presupposes it's compared against humans. I do like the idea of generalizing from a few examples, learning through trial and error without just exhaustive trial and error. Like, that's where it does become intelligence, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can say that should compete with human ability for generalizing and for trial and error, and that's where that's fair.
Some of the core knowledge elements that are mentioned there are 4 of them, and I noticed that most of the animals with a relatively developed nervous system have it, right? Like, for example, I work with the spiders, and something amazing that has happened to me was that we had a male of a new species of spider, and it lost his leg, right? And or lost a couple of legs. And what happened was that in the next couple of weeks, he learned to walk very easily, very nicely on only 3 or 2 legs, right? It's amazing. Yeah, so it's this sense of adaptability. I think that is very deeply engineered by the rules of evolution at different layers in the structure of life. So I think that maybe we could copy that through a similar process of evolution. I think that would be achievable, but maybe not with the technology that we have. But I don't know. I'm ignorant of that. That's right.
You can think of some ways evolution as like a training algorithm, right? Like you have this organism or whatever, if you want to think of it at the level of organism, or maybe at the gene, or maybe at the population or whatever, but you have an algorithm that's running that's kind of like changing what the thing actually is.
So the key is variation, right? The key is a number of elements in the population that are very variable in terms of fitness. And then the system reaches optimality as it just moves forward.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, like one measure over like organisms, for example, is the meaning of life from a biological point of view. First survive, then reproduce, right? And intelligence, in some ways, you can think of it as just a means of doing that. It's not the only strategy though. Like other organisms have other strategies for doing that, but it's one mechanism doing that. Although there is some evidence that suggests like the whole point of like having a brain, and I guess like as a result of that, a mind, is like part of a big thing that has to do with it is just to move your muscles around, right? And I think there's one type of animal, I can't remember what it is, but it has a brain and it swims around, and it attaches itself to something, and then once it attaches itself there, it digests its own brain because it doesn't need it anymore. But I mean, like how relevant is that just for everything you see in humans? Like, I don't know.
So I guess that it depends on the basis of what forms something that resembles a brain, right? Like if you see the sporangia, what do you call the sponges, right? You have the very, very kind of primitive, it's called ancestral state, but it's kind of like a very a primitive looking type of organization in which you have an organism that is made out of a composite of pseudo layers. And they organize, right? And from there you have medusae that have a very, very simplistic nervous system that does exactly what you mentioned. And their only rule is go towards the light and filter, be smart enough to know when you catch something and bring it to your mouth and move your muscles. So it's definitely escalates. So I agree with you.
I mean, one of the things that I kind of found a bit interesting is that in all these discussions of artificial general intelligence, they never really, at least in this paper, it didn't seem like he touched on the word consciousness, which is like, I understand why, because it's a kind of a dirty word, which is difficult to, actually, like even the people in cognitive science don't have a strong definition for it.
Well, it's like saying a soul, for example. I mean, there are definitions of there are definitions of consciousness that are more concrete. I've heard about 5 of them, but the way some people talk about it, it's this thing in the ether that exists, right? Like a soul. Like
So I think in actual cognitive sciences, it's a little more rigorous than that. But you're right, definitely right. Like it doesn't have like a strong definition.
Yeah, and then the question is like, you say, oh well, does a frog have a soul? Or sorry, not a soul. Is a frog conscious? Is a dog conscious? Like, well, what's your definition of consciousness? And let's see if a human's conscious to begin with, right? Under your definition.
Yeah. So with like, there's like different perspectives on what constitutes consciousness, and there's different, usually it's very closely tied to intelligence as well. It's like, how are you basically thinking, and what's the thought process that you're having? That's a lot of the ways that they try to like describe. And one of the things that kind of came to mind is, and I don't know if you ever listened to like the podcasts with Francois as well, he was talking about similar things, is this notion of like distributed cognition, where when you're writing, for example, math equations that you can't do in your head, the pen and paper becomes part of your cognitive process, right? And so like similarly, I could definitely imagine like if we start using programs to augment ourselves in that way, it kind of becomes a part of human consciousness as well, which is, I don't know, like again, it's not really it's just an observation, I guess, or a comment rather than like an actual.
Yeah, but it depends how you define it, right? Like some people, like when they think about consciousness, is what you're paying attention to. Some people, it's like the difference between when you're awake and you're asleep. Like sometimes you're awake, I'm aware of stuff, and then I'm asleep, and like that just ends. And sometimes when your eyes close and you're asleep, you're aware of the passage of time. Sometimes you're not, right? And like I said, like there's different ways people try to grasp consciousness, but it doesn't seem to me like it's a well-defined thing. But if you want it well-defined, you have to pick something, and then. But I think
it's the same issue with intelligence, right? Like I think in this case they're almost one-to-one.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think the word intelligence is well-defined. And even like things when they try to define some of the stuff, right? Like you get into these different kinds of tests. They do find, for example, like some of these, like your score on the test does correlate when people say like this person seems bright, but often also people don't just notice someone being intelligent. They only notice the application of intelligence. Like for example, like the person seems to know a lot about something or has deep expertise, or every time I probe them, they seem to be correct, right? But I mean, a person can be intelligent without like knowing any of that. And it doesn't change if you think intelligence is something like kind of like inherits in you, right? For example, I mean, you could debate whether that's true also, but if you think that's the case, then people don't seem to actually be measuring intelligence. It's somehow like the application of it, right? But if you never apply yourself, people won't notice. By the way, I have to look at your name. Uriel, you were talking about like, going towards the light and all that stuff. Have you ever read the book, Vehicles, Experiments, and Synthetic Psychology?
No.
What's it called again? It's called Vehicles, Experiments in Synthetic Psychology. One guy wrote, I mean, like a lot of times when people write a book or write an article, they're often not the first one to do this. They're just like, they get well known for it. But anyways, in this book, the guy creates these agents, and, they have like, light sensors and like motors. And in one way you have the eye tied to the motor on the right. And when it sees light, that wheel speeds up. And when there's on the left, when there's light on the right, it speeds up the light on that way. And that way it heads towards light. And then you can cross the wires, and then it goes away from the light, et cetera, et cetera. And then like he comes up with like a bunch of these things. And then some people argue that, like intelligence is way too complex to be made up of simple rules. But with the book, what he tries to show is that just the combination of a bunch of simple rules can create very complex behavior, right? Mm-hmm. Which is kind of interesting. Like some of these things you even see in like the brain, like you have this kind of like, straight to the same side crossover from the eyes to the different hemispheres of the brain, which is kind of interesting. But anyways, like, this is an approach of trying to understand intelligence, however you define that. And that maybe there's simple rules governing like intelligence for a certain definition of intelligence.
Yeah, I think I agree with you. I think that some simple underlying rules create complex patterns of behavior. I agree with you. And I think something that we can take from there in terms of structure and physiology is how fractal is the brain itself, right? It's how repeated processes, even in physically speaking, in terms of morphology.
Yeah.
I think that could be something, perhaps. I'm not sure. Yeah. Thank you. I'm going to read you.
Cool. Pam, what do you think?
Why do you pick on me?
I don't know. I just wanted to bring a new person into the conversation. That's all.
Yeah, I was waiting for my turn. I have a lot of notes to talk about, but maybe I'll summarize. So the few things, I really like the paper. I especially like the first two parts. The ARC experiments, I'm not sold, but I'll get to that. But so I really like the distinction between skill versus ability. So they basically call skill an artifact of intelligence, not the intelligence. So I hadn't appreciated that, but it was really nice to have him articulate. I also found it really surprising. I don't know if you noticed Minsky's 1968 code definition of intelligence. So AI is the science of making machines capable of performing tasks that would require intelligence if done by humans. So he appreciated it even back then. This is not intelligence. He just wanted to replicate intelligence without being intelligent. But I guess since then, people have become more ambitious. Now they want to be fully intelligent, whatever that means. There's a couple other really cool things I noticed. I won't go into all my details, but there was a mention of the Occam's razor, which was really cool. He talked about how we do regularization and try to compress our model to be the simplest possible for the given training set. And we hope that would mean that it would generalize. And he says it's actually not that at all, because generalization is trying to basically deal with the uncertainty in the future. That's what he calls it, which basically means that you can't possibly compress, so they go against each other. So if you go with the simplest model that would explain your data, it would not generalize.
Yeah, I thought that was a great observation. Yeah, compressing the past is not the goal here.
So, it looks like that is like an indirect dig at Hutter's definition of intelligence, because his general idea is basically everything that Francois has said, but also we should use Occam's razor because you want to condense down as much knowledge as possible, and then try to extrapolate out from there. So I took that as actually kind of not a dig at Hutter, but where they have a disagreement, because he spends the first several pages just citing him over and over again. So it's well, what is the difference? And I think that is the difference. But he does have a good example.
Yeah, and then there was a few things I was hoping he would talk about, but I guess it was outside of his scope. One of the things that I think is really critical is how do you actually represent and record knowledge, whatever that means. Humans, as far as I know, we don't know how humans do it. Is it even known that you can put a bunch of numbers in a big matrix and that would represent knowledge? I don't think that's true. And so as long as we are multiplying matrices together, no matter how big you make them, maybe you will never get to intelligent systems. So I don't know if that's true, but I guess I would have hoped he would talk about it. And also, along the same lines, Douglas Hofstadter, I'm sure everybody has read his books, Godel, Escher, Buck. He talks all about analogies, how humans' intelligence is based on how we can draw analogies between different domains. As far as I know, there's no tractable way of doing it with actual tasks. But basically, that's how we think. We think in one situation, what is it that applies to another situation? And that's, I think, to me, is the essence of generalization, trying to draw some useful sort of knowledge from something that is similar to the new task. And then regarding the ARC experiments that he talks about, maybe that's a good way to sort of judge whether you have an intelligent system, but I don't see how that's going to help us get there. There's absolutely no gradient towards how do you go about solving that. Even some humans will have problems solving that. So maybe it would be better to have... Yeah, it would be better to have a curriculum where you do a 2-year-old data set, 3-year-old data set, 10-year-old, and so on, so that then you can at least progress towards something that would be intelligent.
That kind of is the point. If it's just to give you some sort of way to benchmark what you're doing, I think he was talking about basically how that pushed all the progress forward, right? So the idea is just to present something, to get people started. And if our current systems don't have the capability of solving the problem, it's fairly indicative, if the problem is represented by the way that he framed it, that we don't have capable systems, right? We need new approaches to solve that.
So I was thinking in that competition, so they were hoping things like cellular automata ideas from those kind of fields maybe applicable, but no one got success on that. A lot of people tried it in that competition, like cellular automata, and they were able to because it looks like something that can fill up a screen using those kind of patterns. So I think he was expecting that kind of intelligence from the participants in that competition, but unfortunately, people didn't make progress with that. But that would have been a generalized knowledge kind of solution.
There was a great notebook, right, in that competition about using silly automata. Do you know how it ended up doing in the competition itself? Like in the competition, what did the top 10 look like? I know the top one was fairly sort of basic, but what do the others in the top 10 look like?
So I've looked at the top 3, and all of them are essentially just like tree searches with like Francois says you should make a DSL, and I think that they spent the majority of their time trying to come up with the best domain-specific language possible, and then doing essentially a brute force tree search. But actually, like one of the things that you said, Payam, that like resonated with me was, so like in psychometrics, like there is the kind of concept of like difficulty between the individual items. So each test, right, has a difficulty associated with them. So like an easy way to think of it is if you can multiply 3-digit numbers together, you definitely should be able to multiply 2-digit numbers together. But there's no concept of difficulty between these tests, right? So that actually gives the intelligent system less information about like the programs than what you would typically expect from like a psychometric assessment, which is something that like I think is a personal like weakness of it. I think overall the idea is good, but yeah, I just wanted to throw that out there because I also kind of saw that as like a.
I guess one final thing I wanted to see what you guys think about is like the whole definitions. I really like his definition better than the other ones that came before it, but he's still centered around achieving a goal. Like, I wonder if that is the essence of intelligence, because like where does like contemplation fit in? Like, what if Socrates is sitting in a cave and thinking about relating things that without any goals? And I feel that's the essence of intelligence, not, I think a goal is just a useful application of intelligence, but I don't know if the definition I would hope can go beyond.
I mean, that thought kind of came to me earlier because it was like...
But the relation is actually a goal in your Socrates.
What, sorry?
The relation between objects, those are actually goals, the relationship.
What is the goal?
Yeah, coordinating things together, finding the connection between things, isn't it? That's the goal.
Well, I mean, what motivates that goal, right? Like, I think that, I don't know if that's what you mean, Payam, but it's kind of like a thought that came to me as well. And also someone mentioned earlier was like, if you don't apply yourself, you might not know that that person's intelligent, right? And similarly, I don't know if you could consider a lot of people to be intelligent, but they might just watch Netflix all day or something like that, then, you know, how does that fit into the picture? So I don't know if that's the sort of thought that you had, Payam, but that came to me as well.
Well, that's fair too, but I mean, this is like, I guess, different than that, because you can just, like, if you look at kids play, like toddlers, like they're just fuddling around, like playing around with things and moving things without any apparent goal. Like, they're not actually trying to do something. They do something random, then they notice, okay, if they push this thing, it moves, then they try to build up on it. There is this randomness. I guess they call it curiosity in reinforcement learning or whatever, but that sort of thing doesn't fit clearly, in my mind, in the definition that they have here.
I think it's a good point. This is a very behaviorist view of intelligence.
But also, even if we're not trying to mimic humans, the whole idea of choosing a goal or choosing a set of goals is something we would want AI to do, right? So, and I think kids actually do make goals all the time. They're always making up games and then shifting the rules like mad. But yeah,
that's actually a good point. I mean, it goes back to Douglas Hofstadter hypothesis that is how, like, he talks about recursions, right? Like, a person can see himself or herself do things, and then think about what he's doing, and then come up with a new goal for itself. And then you can do this multiple recursive steps, and that's what he calls intelligence. And you know, he makes a connection to the Gödel's incompleteness and how you can do it in a machine. I don't know about any of that stuff, but I just feel like there is stuff missing here that could be talked about.
So I have a problem with this work because it took him 2 years to do it. Because the first day he put it on Twitter, I saw it. But my question is, with this pass review, it's difficult for this work to pass review. So maybe he will leave it as an archived work. But this is a lot of work. He was able to do a lot of concepts, quantifying things in maths, which is very difficult. So he did a good job. So, but I doubt if it can pass review because a lot of people have different, different notions.
Where would you even submit this? I don't know what kind of journal would publish this. This is just like an opinion piece, I guess. It's interesting, but.
A Journal of Theoretical Computer Science, maybe?
You're going to have to make a new journal, no?
Let's see. Does Scott have access to a mic? Maybe not. But Randall, you probably do. Any thoughts?
Yeah. A few key words here. First thing, I think there's something missing in the whole discussion about artificial intelligence, about intelligence in animals, and it's never been touched. It's never been mentioned. It's a word that starts with E. Starts with E.
Emotions.
Emotions, yeah. So yeah. I'd say that emotions play a key role in intelligence. We feel what's right. We're directed to searching for things because we feel it. We remember stuff because we attach emotions to them. We order facts because we attach emotions to them. Imagine life without emotions. I mean, it's incomprehensible. A computer is a person without emotions. What do you expect from that?
Yeah,
that's my first comment.
I kind of interpreted what in the paper talked about priors as it including this, like these. I mean, like maybe I'm giving the author too much credit, but like I kind of assumed like all the what you might call instincts. Like although like there'd be a more detailed explanation from a behavioral scientist, but like what normal person might call instincts, the emotions would probably come under that bucket, right? There's a lot of stuff baked into us, and like the way it kind of manifests happens in different ways. But I'd assume that was part of it.
Okay.
Have you read the book by Antonio Damasio, The Strange Order of Things? That's his whole thesis in the book, that he says emotions are a very significant part of that.
Yeah, I think there were people who were interested in like reinforcement learning from an animal point of view, but I think the way animals, including humans, differ from the reinforcement learning models is our emotions. It's been a while since I read this. I remember reading something like about this that's like we basically humans do seem to do something like reinforcement learning in the behavioral sciences sense of the word, but it's not completely, and there's complications. There's differences that humans seem to have. I just brought up the book.
I have another key word. Moving on to a slightly different topic, but this is very relevant to what I do and I teach. I think a lot of my colleagues, we're trying to teach students, say, mathematics, and these students find it so hard to go beyond just learning the basic skills of calculations and techniques. And I keep telling them over and over again, in we assess you at university level, we're assessing your ability. And that's actually exactly the word that he's using in the paper. We're assessing, we're measuring your ability, not your skills. Your skills are one aspect of your learning, and it's important, but we're trying to measure your ability. Now, the students, they stare at me because they're not used to that. They come from high schools and they're trained in math courses just to reproduce calculations. They hit the universities and now we're asking them to generalize. Okay, generalize, guys. I use the word creativity when I'm talking to them. I'm saying you have to be creative, okay? Now, you can't just tell them that. You have to train them to do that. So now I'm thinking about these developers that are building these machines on the computer. Maybe they should be reading some of the education literature. Maybe they should be thinking about teaching kids, mathematics. Some of the strategies I use when I talk to my students, how do you gain this ability to be creative? Because I'm going to throw them a brand new question on the test, and they just hate that. But that's what I'm going to give them, and that's what they're going to have to show their ability on. And I say, so some strategies, okay, while you're practicing skills, you're looking for underlying structure. When you look at a new problem, you look at strategies to attack a new problem, and you make a note of that. So you're building up this compilation of knowledge, but from a meta cognitive point of view, not simply the technical things you did on the paper, but you're looking back at it and you're saying, why did I choose this path and not this path? Another thing I tell students to do is when you acquire a list of concepts, someone mentioned this before, go up into the cave and meditate. Yeah, look, or Kenneth said this. Yeah, Kenneth, look at the connections between the concepts. When you think to yourself, when you're an active learner, not a passive learner, these machines are passive learners. We're active learners. I'm asking questions. Why this definition? What's the connection between this and that? What would happen if this happened and this happened? I tell my students, you have to be like this to gain that ability to do those problems you've never seen before. This is what's training you to do those.
Yeah, I think that, in large part, that's actually what, not with all the emotions, but in terms of active learning, I think that is what Francois is actually trying to get machine learning scientists as a field to do, right? And right now, the baseline is just dumb tree search. But to me, it seems like the way to actually solve these problems, once you have your domain, right, your domain-specific language and all the functions you need, is to be able to intuit. Intuit for a computer is very different, but they have certain weights that bias towards, I've seen an example of this in a different, a different setting, a different training, a different task, right? It's kind of like that task, but it was easier. So what are the things that need to be added to it, right? And that might just be done through weights and through recognition. He's very into this idea of a sort of program modules and recombining modules and stuff like that. I think that's trying to get to this active learning kind of component where, to see the result and see where it started from, and to recognize that, there were other examples that were kind of like this, right? Is extremely difficult. Obviously extremely difficult because we're not even close to getting it. But I think that is the way forward on this is to try to find ways of propagating this very sparse information back up this tree.
There is another sort of line of discussion that's very popular in all these the recent AI conferences I've been to, is all about how much do you want to put in the system, they call it about priors. And some people are really purists, they think you should put absolutely nothing, and they don't want to have anything to do with adding any knowledge. And then others, they want to put everything in. So, but I liked his list of, Bruce, you might not like it, but he talks about cause and effect relationships, and he lists a few other things like the compact object, the fact that things just don't disappear, continuity over time. He sort of enumerates some of them, but there's probably more that we can't think of. I'm curious, what do people think? Is it something you would demand from your algorithm to discover by itself, or do you want to sort of put it in somehow?
I'm fully in favor of priors. The example that's closest to what I do is convolutional neural networks. There's a whole inductive bias there about prior knowledge about images, translation and variance, local coherence, a whole bunch of stuff, right, that just makes that work really well. And it was a human being that had to kind of inject that prior into it. Having done that, then it can learn very effectively from that point forward. But I'm fully in favor of it. And I think the priors that he identified for his task were completely reasonable.
Yeah, and if you look at also how the human system works, for example, the vision system, in your the way that your vision system works does have parts which are similar to convolutional filters, right? So I'm not suggesting that you should try to copy everything that a human does to try to go towards an artificial general intelligence, but it is somehow encoded in our own bodies as well when we're trying to interact with the world. So I think it does make sense that you would want to have some of that encoded into your machine.
I never quite figured out whether the human visual system actually inspired convolutional neural networks, or that this was sort of some back explanation.
I think it did. Afterwards. I can't remember, but yeah, I took a cognitive science class as my last course in university. So it was just a 100 level class, but it was kind of interesting to touch on all these things that were very closely related to, the deep learning stuff as well. So.
Anyway, I'm all in favor of priors, and I think the idea of excluding them and demanding that your algorithms learn them all by themselves, like, no, that doesn't make any sense to me.
One criticism is if you get any of them wrong, that would impede your algorithm from like outperforming humans. So that's one issue. And the other is just if you just care about the nature of intelligence and just want to study it, you want to know if you can create it from scratch the same way evolution did, right? You don't care to actually get it to work on a real world application. You just want to see how the science works.
Yeah, well, if you've got a couple of billion years to let your solution evolve, sure, go for it.
By the way, there are people
or TPUs.
We can innovate way faster than humans.
There are people. I did this a long time ago too, but there are people who create simulations and have creatures in them, and then have them evolve over time. Right. And like, I mean, they usually build some structure into the organism. Like, they have sights that they can see in certain places. They have some kind of neural network, and then they have genes that encode this. And then, sorry, the sirens go by all day.
We can hear you over the sirens. It's okay.
So some of them are quite interesting. Like, I've seen some people have these simulations where like pack behavior evolves. Like, you have like a bunch of creatures and they start hunting in packs. They start hunting in packs, right? And some of them look like very, very interesting, right? They seem to simulate like stuff you see in nature, which is quite cool in a lot of ways. And it's like, oh, you just kind of like set up some basics and just let it, fast forward. You have some expensive GPUs. You watch it for a while because it looks cool, and then you just run, like super, super fast while you're not watching it, and then come back to it. And it's like, oh, they've been doing some interesting behavior.
What were they encoded? Like, what were their priors?
So I mean, like when I was doing it, for example, like I wasn't thinking of it in terms of priors. I was thinking, okay, I'll make it kind of see, and I'll give it a neural network, and I'll, like it has to survive, right? For example, and then it can reproduce at a certain point and create stuff that's kind of like itself but mutated. And then just over time, if you have a bunch of different kind of creatures, sometimes certain things, like certain kind of behaviors evolve. But I guess the priors would be like you had vision, you had something that was like a brain, although it's just like a neural network.
Do they have the goal of just surviving, or there is additional parameters?
Well, I mean, it wasn't like an explicit goal. It was just you had no more of those things to like for the next generation to keep on going unless it survived, right? Unless it survived long enough to reproduce. But it sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just going to ask, how is this called?
I don't remember. Like long time ago, I saw someone do it on YouTube, and I thought, "Oh, that's cool."
Yeah, there's a guy, Kenneth Stanley. He works with evolution. Like he had a website. I can't find his website now, but if you look him up, he has a site. It's all about evolution. He had a website where basically somebody starts with some initial shape and then let it go. It evolves, and then somebody else can come in and makes a little difference, and then it keeps evolving, and eventually you get really complicated shapes like butterflies and other things.
So cool. I wasn't talking about that. That's very interesting too. I liked that stuff. But this was something else. Initially, like I think I saw this like maybe 15 years ago or 10 years ago or something like that time frame. I saw someone do it on YouTube. I thought it was cool. I tried it myself, and then I noticed a whole bunch of other people doing it. Right? They were just creating these kind of like simulated environments. Some of them were 2D, some of them were 3D, and you had these creatures in there. And you just kind of like let them like interact with each other. There's ways of getting food and eating stuff. There's ways of like competing with other organisms where you might kill it or whatever. And it was just kind of cool. And you ended up getting these interesting behaviors if you just let the simulation run long enough, which I thought was pretty cool. Like I was heavily interested in like strong AI, like what they're calling artificial general intelligence here. But I was heavily interested in that. So I was really into this kind of stuff at one point. Although now,
but that looks like agent-based modeling, isn't it?
It depends what you mean by agent-based model. I mean, if you're talking about like, for example, like running a Monte Carlo simulation where you kind of like simulate the universe with a bunch of agents over and over and over again and trying to use that to approximate some kind of distribution of like what's possible, like what are the most likely things to happen. I say it's not quite like that, but you could think of the creatures in this thing as agents, because you're just kind of like, you're not running it over and over again. You're just run it through and going forward in time, right? And just seeing like where things go. Although if you start making these things, you'll eventually learn to save it at certain checkpoints, because if your computer crashes and then like all that evolution is kind of gone if you didn't actually save it. But that's an interesting thing. Yeah.
There's another thing that's kind of related to that is, I think somebody already mentioned it, is like the idea of distributed intelligence. So like a hive, I mean, every single bee is not intelligent, but the hive is super intelligent. It can adapt and it can deal with a lot of things. So you could argue that humans, maybe the human body is similar, but we're only conscious of what we call AGI, but it's actually a lot bigger. And so there's different ways of thinking about it.
Have you heard of the Chinese room?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it kind of reminds me of that. It depends what you mean by intelligence, right? Like there are interactions between multiple agents or individuals that sometimes seem like greater than the sum of its parts. Humans, for example, some of the things you see with culture, and I mean culture in the social learning point of view, right? Like information passed from one individual to another one, often across many generations, where they're like maybe the originator or some of the originators are not even alive anymore, right? It seems like what that sense culture seems to be a system of solving problems that we're not even necessarily aware of existing. There's one example given, although people dispute how good this example is, but there's a tribe in South America that they eat this, I think it's a root. I think it's called cassava. And with cassava, they go through this ritual, and I think they prepare it like maybe 2 days or 3 days or 5 days or something like that. And what that ritual does is it removes the cyanide from the cassava. So cassava contains a bit of cyanide. Cyanide's highly toxic. It doesn't contain a lot, but if you ate it for like a decade, you get some form of cyanide poisoning and maybe have fertility problems, right? And the ritual removes that. And this is the thing. The suggestion is that like the people who go through this ritual, one, they don't know what cyanide is. Two, they don't know the ritual removes it. But they have this social institution, this social pattern of behavior that solves this problem they don't even know exists. And some argue that even like in culture everywhere, including our culture, the institutions, like, the practices, the behaviors, like things like you grew up with, like things your parents taught you, like think like even like the institution of marriage or the institution of washing your hands, or like there's so many things you probably not even like consciously aware that you do that just get passed on from individual. Some of these things solve problems that exist that you're not aware of. Of course, like one of the problems is sometimes that behavior solved the problem that used to exist, but it no longer exists, and the behavior might be harmful to you, right? And like the tough thing is, like with culture, is you don't know which parts are still useful, you don't know which parts that aren't, right? And it's tough to like know, like what do you keep, what do you discard? And of course, like your environment changes all the time, so what's useful now might not be useful in the future. And you also get like cultural, cultural behaviors that emerge that aren't helpful at all, that might be even harmful or neutral. But that gets into like kind of like a larger kind of like intelligence like that's beyond that. By the way, have you ever looked at like ant intelligence, like ant pathfinding with their pheromones and all that stuff?
Yeah, that's very cool.
Like when ants walk around, they'll find the shortest path to food, and they'll lay down a pheromone trail. And if they find some, if I remember correctly, I might be misremembering, when they find some food, they walk back on the same path. And by doing that, they lay down the pheromone trail. It gets stronger and stronger. And other ants will follow that to find the food. They'll come back, and it keeps on reinforcing that path. And like ants know where to go based on that. The ants don't completely do, it's like every now and then they take a random path, and taking that random kind of divergence allows them to find shorter paths sometimes, or find like other food source, because like maybe like, did this initially, sorry, I'm doing the camera. You did this initially, and then the ant kind of like cuts through and like, oh, here's a shorter path. And people start taking that, for example, right? But like there are failure modes to this, right? Like every now and then the ants start going in a circle. And what happens? Well, going in a circle, it's reinforcing. And other ants come like, oh, this is great. Let me go on this. And they keep on going in this thing that's called an ant mill. And then eventually they collapse from exhaustion and starve to death, right? And it does seem like even with like the human, like what you might include as culture, or some of this also relates to like, things that relate to culture, like for example, like status and prestige and all that stuff. There does seem to be failure modes similar to that ant mill, but with humans, which is kind of interesting too. Anyways, separate discussion.
Can we keep going around the room here? Because there's a few people we haven't heard from yet. I would love to.
Sorry, I started discussing. I usually do that. Who we missed? Pam, you went. Laura, did you go?
I talked enough. Don't worry.
Uriel, did you get a chance? Okay. Matt, do you want to say anything else?
No, I'm good. Yeah.
Okay. Kenneth? No. Randall?
Okay. Thanks.
Okay. Mike, you haven't said anything.
Yeah, I mean, I was just, here for the discussion, right? But it's nice to sort of some of the points that were brought up, which is sort of things that I was thinking about during it. I mean, I think one of the things was I noticed was kind of feels like you're trying to sort of tie one hand behind its back to develop these systems by wanting it to be sort of human-like in some way. And maybe some of these things are necessary, right? So energy efficiency, probably any system that we would want to conceive of should be energy efficient on some level, unless we sort of go down the sort of emergence of creating a planet that has intelligence, right? So Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, that sort of level of intelligence, maybe. But yeah, so I mean, I was just sort of but we've already discussed that a lot. The sort of, do we really need it to be human intelligence, or it's the closest thing we have, but at the same time, are we just constraining it unnecessarily? But yeah.
So sorry, I do have one more thing, and it was just like a really interesting observation from the Kaggle forum, where someone pointed out that, oh, these priors are incomplete. Yeah, and he gives a great example, which is to humans, all of the black pixels in the ARC competition register as background. That's never encoded in any of the priors, and it's just something that to us is so obvious we don't even count it as a prior. But yeah, that's another way that we are essentially tying this algorithm behind its back, or these algorithms behind its back.
I followed some links for some of the other test beds that he talked about, and they're doing even more. They're putting all red as danger, as don't go there, green as very good, and there's a lot of color encoding sometimes.
Could you send that?
And culturally dependent color encodings.
That one's culturally. Matt, there's another one that doesn't seem to be culturally encoded as far as I know. Cool colors, what we call cool colors, tend to be background colors. Hot color or warm colors tend to be foreground colors.
Good. Charles and Laura, could you both send me those links? And
sure.
I would love to.
It's going to be somewhere in my Twitter feed.
And David, unless Mike, do you have anything else to say?
No, that's it for me. Thanks.
Yeah. David, anything else?
Sorry, my laptop's not unmuting easily. No, nothing immediately to add or no. I have notes, but they're all scattered. I guess one thing that I was asking about, or I was talking to, or responding to Payam, and wasn't quite the thing he was thinking of, is that notion of a motivation. And he was talking about, he being Francois, was talking about how why in certain parts when he was describing how you get to a goal, it's we're not describing why you want this goal in particular, so something like that. And I don't know if that's a useful thing to also incorporate, because again, what I was talking about was some people are motivated to go do things and apply their intelligence, other people are not. I don't know if that's just kind of going further down the path where we already don't know where to start and it's not particularly meaningful in this context or not, but just kind of a thought that came to my mind if people had anything.
It's a huge can of worms, right?
Yeah.
My thinking is that in general, if we have artificially intelligent agents interacting with the real world, we want to give them the goals. We don't want them to think of their own goals because they may not align with ours.
Yeah, I guess even from that perspective, true. From a philosophical point of view,
yeah. The thing is, also if we gave the artificial intelligence some of our goals, we might not like it. I've heard people, for example, say, you should you should program morality into artificial intelligence. I think that would end in a disaster.
Oh yeah, totally.
Most likely, and there's two perspectives. There's one perspective is what we act like morality is, right? There's a lot of things we talk about on morality. There's morality, ethics, ideology, politics. There's another term. I can't remember the other one, but I usually I try to use a neutral term like preferences, right? But there's a whole there's ways that these things fall apart. For example, if you take the classical kind of utilitarian happy maximization, right? For example, you might say you can do anything as long as it increases the overall average happiness, right? And of course, you have to be able to measure happiness. There's 5 different ways that I've heard of, but let's ignore that for now. Okay, you can do anything you want. Fine. Who's the least happy person? Kill them, right? Who's the next least happy person? Kill them. I'm not saying this is good, but an AI might figure this out, right? Oh, I just need to increase this, right? That'll end disaster, right? It's not necessarily, that's not what you intended, but it does what you say, right? So you wouldn't want to do that. But then you get into what does like what we call morality or ethics or ideology or politics, whatever, what is that actually in humans? If you did that, it might do it better than us, right? So I wouldn't recommend either, to be honest.
Also, it's pretty much impossible. If you create some entity that's smarter than us, and then you want to control it by give it objectives, like, I mean, that's almost like violating itself. Like, it'll figure out how to get you to give it the objective it wants.
Possibly, but like, yeah.
Something that I just wanted to mention is that what do you guys think about the factor of fear? That we were talking about emotions as a possible prior, because it's something that sometimes drives evolution, right? Like it's the fear of survival.
It seems like you need to have some negative consequences and then put in some risk aversion or something somehow to capture that.
I would like to add boredom. They've got all these curiosity-driven algorithms. I think there should be boredom-driven.
No, that's a good point, Laura, actually.
You're familiar with the concept of constructive procrastination? So it's not boredom quite, but you're supposed to do something you don't want to do, so you find yourself getting very productive and all these other things. They need to build that in as well. It's one of my best techniques. Since I got the floor, I got a couple other things to say. I don't want to give people the wrong idea about this, my reaction to this paper. It's true, I'm not very interested in AGI, but I'm intellectually interested. And this is kind of the perfect paper for somebody like me, because I don't really want to spend any time on it. But I thought it was really well written. I love the clarity of exposition, the clarity of thought behind it. I'm sure people who are more knowledgeable about the field could pick holes in how accurate his representation of stuff is. But it seemed like a really good survey. I got a lot out of it without having to spend a lot of time on it. So that much appreciated. I think the ARC dataset concept is brilliant, and putting it up as the Kaggle competition is utterly brilliant. I would have been shocked if anybody did better than 20%, because it's one of these things. It's very simple for humans to do these things, super hard for computers. And whether it really takes us in a direction of AGI, I don't know, but it's like program generation type of stuff. That seems pretty interesting. So as an intellectual curiosity, absolutely fascinating. So I appreciate all that. The section 2, I probably got a little less out of that because it was kind of a detailed, very formal definitions of things. I also wasn't quite so clear how I couldn't connect the dots between what he was doing there and this ARC data set. And I think maybe Matt commented on that earlier, that in some ways there was a bit of a disconnect there. So I don't know if anybody can clarify that or not. I mean, do people feel that section 2 and all those definitions of the algorithmic complexity and very precise definitions of generalizability and so on, how did that play into ARC? Sorry, what's that?
The major fault that Matt identified, I think tears the whole thing down. Like, it's really hard to actually measure that generalizability difficulty of a task set. And if you can't quantify that, then the measure is not useful. It's a great idea if we could.
Yeah.
And maybe that's just another one of those challenges he set out to the community. But yeah.
It's just one of the things, like, and this is just like a general thing, and I've never really got heads or tails of it. But every time I see like some sort of algorithmic information theory, they always talk about values that just can never be measured, right? Like that seems to be like every single, it's like, look at the entropy of like every possible like program that can exist. Or like, it's like, how? I think that you could probably get decent approximations, right? Mm-hmm. But like, without actually having that, I think like it is like a pretty significant weakness. But I think it is also possible. Let's say that we crowdsource, that we turn this into the new, like, what is that called, that they get all the computer science students to do, Leak Code or Hacker Rank or whatever, and it becomes like you do code golf and you have to go get the shortest solution for all of these like different things, right? And then that becomes the new like approximation of what the actual like complexity is. Like maybe that would be enough. But also like there's probably like, just going through like about a dozen of them, like I have an intuition for which ones I think are much harder than others, right? So there's definitely something there, and they are like not equal at all, and they involve different skills. So I don't know, but it is still like it's
You
very
could
weird to go
crowdsource
so
it
long.
first from humans and then crowdsource it from the solutions themselves when they start to trickle in.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true.
So I have one more silly comment, and that'll wrap it up for me. But the silly comment is, so I have a couple of grandkids who live in Ontario. The oldest one is 5.5. So to stay connected, we do Zoom calls and things. And to kind of engage with them, we play games over Zoom. So I'm really curious to take some of these puzzles that are in ARC and present them as puzzles to be solved over Zoom and see how a 5-year-old does on them. Because I think some of them he'll get right away. Others maybe not so much, but it'll give me some insight into what human priors are actually, how good are they at that age.
Yeah, sorry, I keep on jumping in on this, but yeah, like this was another thing that I found very weird. Is they're like, we have human priors, everyone has this, it's evolutionarily ingrained, and then it says like one sentence on the ARC data set, oh well, 1 out of 3 high IQ people were able to solve each of these, right?
Well, at least 1 out of 3.
At least 1 out of 3, right? I was thinking,
they had to ensemble 3 high IQ human beings to solve the whole data set. Yeah,
I think it was Laura who said it was like, yeah, we need like a 5-year-old version of this, right? Like,
yeah, I'd love that.
That would be an actual like some sort of a stepping stone. Of course, like we're not getting human level intelligence right now, but whatever. Like it is interesting.
Cool. All right, I'll pass the baton. Or maybe it's time to vote on the papers. Maybe we've been around. I think we have.